I'm going to swear you in, actually, so please remain standing. Do you affirm that the testimony that you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Please be seated. Thank you very much. We'll start with introductory remarks by our judicial nominees. We'll start with our judicial nominees. Ms. Cartwright, go ahead, and then Ms. Wong, and then we'll go to Mr. Dettelbach.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal, and to Chair Durbin and Ranking Member Grassley for holding this hearing. I am so thrilled to be here today. I want to begin by thanking President Biden for the incredible honor of this nomination. I would also like to thank Senator Murray and Senator Cantwell for their support of my nomination, and Senator Murray for her kind words of introduction today. Finally, I would like to thank the members of my district's nonpartisan Judicial Selection Committee for recommending me for this position. I'm so lucky to have here with me today several members of my family. First with me today is my husband, John, who has supported every step of my career since we first met in college, and our son, who is the light of our lives and makes sure that every day has moments of both humility and joy. Also joining me are my parents, Doreen and Stuart, who raised me to set high expectations for myself and to believe, even as a child, that my thoughts mattered. And my father and mother-in-law, Alan and Betty, whose families came to the United States from China in search of a better life, and who went on to build a successful future for themselves and their own children in Houston, Texas. My sister Victoria and her family could not be here today in person, but I know they are watching from Kuwait, where she serves our country in the Foreign Service. I am also so grateful throughout this process to have had the support of my colleagues from my law firm and tight-knit groups of friends from both college and law school. Only one of them could be here in person today, but I know many more are watching from all around the world. Finally, I want to note the personal significance to me of having been nominated for a seat in Tacoma, Washington. I am among the 5th generation of my family to reside in Washington State, and my great-grandfather was a blacksmith for the Northern Pacific Railroad, working on trains that came and went from Union Station in Tacoma. Union Station is now the federal courthouse where I will sit if confirmed, and I can only imagine how proud my family would be today. Thank you. I look forward to answering the committee's questions.
Ms. Wong.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and the members of the Senate Judiciary Committee for the opportunity to appear before you today. Many thanks to President Biden for this nomination and to Senator Bennett for his kind words and Senator John Hickenlooper for their recommendation, as well as our Judicial Nomination Committee. I am so truly humbled to be here today. There is no doubt that I would not be here without many people. First, I thank my husband, Doug. It should come as no surprise that Doug has made small and large sacrifices, often untold and perhaps even underappreciated, so I could be considered for this seat. He and our son Luke are at home finishing out a final week of school. Our daughter Kelsey is here with me today, and I hope both of them remember that Dad and I are so proud of who you are, not what you do. Being your wife and mom will always be my highest honor and most important work. Also with me today are 2 of my dearest friends, Dr. Jamie Solomon and Celine Coe, who have shared my greatest joys and hardest losses. I would like to thank my parents, Chenshi and Hope, whose immigration and action taught with hard work, education, and resilience that I could achieve my dreams. Thanks to my brother Ken, my tireless cheerleader, his husband Mark, my parents-in-law Robert and Carol, my brother and sister-in-law Kevin and Elaine, and my nieces and nephew David, Ben, and Aaron. I also thank the Hu family and the greater Taiwanese American community in Kansas, who stood in as our extended family as I grew up. And as I sit in the Senate today, I cannot miss the opportunity to thank the late Robert Dole, who was instrumental in my family's immigration story. I am ever grateful to Judge Peter Massetti, who remains my mentor, and with Judge Paul Friedman, opened the doors of the judiciary first to me. I want to especially thank Natalie Hanlon-Lay, Timothy McDonald, and Leslie Hayden, who were instrumental in this process. Finally, I would like to take a moment to thank my entire court family in the District of Colorado, particularly my law clerks and magistrate judge colleagues, whose hard work and dedication has brought me here today, and Judge Christine Arguello, whose seat for which I am being considered. Her contributions to Colorado's legal community are truly unparalleled. Thank you for allowing me to make these introductions, Senators, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Dettelbach?
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. I also want to thank Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and all the committee members here. And also thanks to Senator Brown for that very kind introduction and his support. I appreciate the heartfelt words I've heard today from the Chairman and Ranking Member Grassley about yesterday's tragedy in Uvalde. The pain that those families and really the whole community and all of us feel, but especially those families, is just unimaginable to me. I think for me and for many, last night was a night where parents everywhere hugged their kids just a little bit harder at the end of the day. I know I did. My thoughts are very much with the community in Texas that are suffering so deeply, and with other communities, because this event can be a catalyst for other people who've gone through this to relive some of the great pain that they feel. I also want to thank President Biden for nominating me to be the director of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. And I will say, as a former staff detailee on this committee, I am especially honored to be here today. I spent the majority of my career in public service as a prosecutor. And that service of over 20 years is not possible without a really supportive family. I want to thank my wife, Carol, who is here along with my children, Allie and David, for their love and support. I lost my mom and my dad both not too long ago, but I know that they're with me. And my mom's kid sister and my dad's big brother, my Aunt Rita and Uncle Dick, are both here to support me and to remind me of the example my folks set for me. My mom, who was a teacher, especially poignant today. And my wonderful father-in-law, Saul Bialostowski, who brought his family, including my wife, to this great country to raise her in Texas almost 50 years ago, is here with us as well. Finally, especially given the horrible events we all saw of the last day, I want to thank again the brave and dedicated men and women of law enforcement, and especially the ATF. I've worked with ATF agents and seen their work for 30 years. And it's not just the agents. From the agents, of course, who respond to horrific crime scenes and they risk their lives standing shoulder to shoulder with state and local cops on the street, to the analysts and staff who anonymously pore over evidence and data late into the night to try to make a case, to the bomb technician responding to a horrible incident and a dangerous incident, to the lab person who's working against time trying to make a ballistic match, and more. I want those people and the others at the ATF to know that I honor that service. And I want both they and the public they protect to know, if I'm giving the privilege of becoming a Senate-confirmed ATF director, that I will work every day to join them as a leader and as a partner in both good times and bad. We face many threats to public safety, both new and old. Violent crime is increasing. Firearms violence and mass shootings are increasing. Hate crimes and religious violence are increasing, as is violent extremism. If confirmed, I promise to do everything I can to enforce the law, to respect the Constitution of the United States, and to partner with law enforcement to protect the safety and the rights of innocent and law-abiding Americans. And I vow, if I'm given the privilege of serving as director, to partner with others to advance the cause of public safety and to approach that task, especially now, here now, with an open heart, with open ears, and always with an open mind. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Dettelbach. The chair has returned, but with his permission, I'm going to make a very brief statement and ask some questions. Mr. Dettelbach, I want to join you in thanking the extraordinary professionals of ATF, the agency that you've been nominated to lead, having been a federal prosecutor, the United States Attorney in Connecticut, for 4.5 years. I worked with this agency and I have followed their work over the years, and there's no more dedicated and brave group of professionals. And what we've seen over the last 24 hours, again, we've seen it repeatedly over these years, is the devotion of local law enforcement and state police to stopping gun violence and rescuing the victims and survivors of gun violence in this country. President Biden has made it clear that his administration is committed to combating the surge in violent crime in communities across the United States. But as we know, violent crime cannot be stopped without also stopping gun violence. Firearms make violent crime all the more violent and all the more likely to be deadly. The best laws on the books are dead letter if they are not enforced effectively, and it will be your job to make sure that the premier federal agency responsible for gun violence has the mandate and the independence to pursue it diligently, fearlessly, and ferociously. You come here at a moment of extraordinary anguish, anxiety, and anger in this country. And I believe that we must move forward with gun violence prevention reforms that will make our laws more effective and give you more tools that you need in saving communities and individual lives. I believe in the Second Amendment. It's the law of the land. There are measures we can take that are consistent with the Second Amendment that will separate people from firearms if they are dangerous to themselves or others. Red flag statutes, background checks, safe storage, like Ethan's law, ghost guns, bans, and others. When it comes to tackling these kinds of problems, we need an agency that is not only independent, but will be perceived as independent, beyond the influence and grip of the gun lobby, which all too often has been perceived as having undue impact on the ATF. And that perception itself can undermine an agency's effectiveness. So as much as I feel that you will bring new leadership, I think it is important that we move forward to give you that opportunity as quickly as possible, particularly seizing this moment of extraordinary challenge to make sure you have a mandate from the United States Congress to do your job. Let me ask you how you will draw on your background as a prosecutor to make sure that you're effective in this job.
Senator, I have spent the vast majority of my career as a prosecutor. Over 20 years, I've worked in, and it is a core value of mine, something that I have lived with and that I will continue, that politics can play no role in law enforcement, none at all. I worked under Republican administrations and I worked under Democratic administrations as a federal prosecutor. And I have lived that credo and I vow to continue to do it because people need to have confidence that people in law enforcement's only agenda is to enforce the law, and if you're at the ATF, to catch the bad guys and protect the public. I'd like to think that my record doing that is one of the reasons why I have support of over 140 senior Justice Department officials and a bipartisan support from Deputy Attorney General for Donald Trump and the Deputy Attorney General for President Bush, as well as the Deputy Attorney General for President Obama, from Assistant Attorney Generals on both sides of the aisle, and from U.S. attorneys in my state who were both appointed by President Trump and in other states. And I vow to never let politics in any way influence my action as ATF director.
You have a record of combating, in fact, a track record of combating extremism, in particular religion-motivated violence. While U.S. Attorney, you were praised by both Republicans and Democrats for combating that kind of violent extremism. We know that a number of gun violence incidents, some of the most deadly, most recently in Buffalo, but also Oak Creek, Charleston, Charlottesville, Pittsburgh, El Paso, were motivated by this kind of white supremacy, anti-religion, particularly religious faith kind of violence. How will that experience by you in dealing with such incidents be part of your motivation here?
Senator, I have seen I started 30 years ago, I've seen both the incidents and the audacity of anti-religious violence grow over time. It was there when I started, but things have seemed to unfortunately go in the wrong direction. And I will say this as somebody who's a prosecutor and as somebody who's raising Jewish children as a religious minority in this country. I spent time in Pittsburgh. I talked to people at Tree of Life. When I was U.S. Attorney, the largest mosque in my state was torched. An African-American church was torched. We caught a fellow in Toledo who had stockpiled. This is a convicted killer, somebody who had shot 3 people, killed 1, had a felony record for that, and we found him in Toledo with 18 weapons, 40,000 rounds of ammunition, a Kevlar vest, and surveillance evidence that he was scouting out and following the head of the Jewish Community Federation in Detroit and the head of the NAACP in Detroit. And thankfully, the Joint Terrorism Task Force caught that person. Senator, this is part of who I am, and it is a core American value to be able to have religious freedom and to worship without fear of violence. We have to make sure we protect that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Dettelbach. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Blumenthal. Mr. Dettelbach, last year in Chicago, my wife and I attended a memorial service for a Chicago policewoman. Her name was Ella French. She was gunned down in the streets of Chicago in her squad car, and her partner was shot in the head as well. He lost his sight in one eye. The death of Ella French gripped that city like nothing I've ever seen. At the memorial service, there were uniformed policemen from all over Illinois and the Midwest and beyond, standing in the heat for hours to show their respects. It turned out that the weapon that was used to kill her was a straw purchase, meaning that a person with a clean record went to the gun dealer, federally licensed gun dealer, and legally purchased the gun to hand it over to the person who took Ella French's life. This so-called straw purchase has been viewed in the past by some as a bookkeeping matter, a misdemeanor type matter, or at least low on the priority list. When it came to the life of this policewoman, it was certainly not a misdemeanor matter. It was a matter of life and death. Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Agency, which you seek to head, has as one of its responsibilities the administration of the laws applying to these federally licensed gun dealers. What is the proper approach when it comes to prosecution? What is the proper approach when we instruct federal licensees who are selling guns that they have a duty to accurately and honestly ascertain whether a person is eligible to buy a gun?
Senator, the proper approach to enforcing these laws, which are on the books, it's illegal to straw purchase. But the proper approach is, number one, a team approach. So one of the things I've seen in law enforcement, and I know that they're trying in Chicago, is to make sure that we're working together with state and local law enforcement in task forces, and I'm a big fan of the task force approach, to make sure that we're in the communities listening to local police officers about the threats that they're facing. So if they see a threat, a certain threat, if it's a straw purchase threat, if it's firearms coming from another place, we're listening to them. With respect to how to handle them, it's not a paperwork offense when somebody intentionally lies and buys and is able to get a firearm unlawfully for another person. And the lie is you check the box that says it's for you and it's really for somebody else. And those should be prosecuted to the extent of the law. It's a very serious violation.
And of course, if a gun is purchased without a background check, there is no way to know what the circumstances are for the buyer or who the ultimate purchaser of the gun might be. Is that correct?
That's correct, Senator.
Ms. Cartwright, in the course of your practice, you've dealt with law enforcement. You have represented law enforcement and you've represented those who were charging police misconduct. Tell me your view of the role of law enforcement today and the common conversation about reforming police.
Senator, thank you, Chair Durbin. Senator, my role in those issues has primarily been as a litigator, both representing law enforcement officers who are excelling in their jobs but are facing illegal conditions at work, and also representing people whose clearly established constitutional rights have been violated and for whom Congress provided a remedy for that in 42 U.S.C. Section 1983. In my role as an attorney, I have looked at my specific cases and the legal claims and specific evidence for my clients in advancing their interests. And I have been proud to represent all of those clients and the important interests that those cases play in our constitutional order.
Thank you. Senator Lee.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dettelbach, let's start with you. Every time one of these tragedies occurs, I think we for far too long just failed to look back at the root causes of rampage violence. Questions involving things like why is our culture suddenly producing so many young men who want to murder innocent people? Raises questions like, could things like fatherlessness, the breakdown of families, isolation from civil society, or the glorification of violence be contributing factors? Instead, the left, once again, is calling for more gun control. They want to crack down on law-abiding Americans and federal firearms licensees who want to follow the law instead of armed criminals. For example, as I recall, Mr. Dettelbach, you've called for every type of gun control, and under your leadership as U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Ohio, the number of prosecutions of firearms and explosives cases filed by the office actually decreased by almost half, from 123 cases filed in 2008 to only 65 cases filed in 2016. Now, there may well be reasons for that. I'm not familiar with all the operations of the office at the time, but I think it's worth inquiring into. But what's even more outrageous, though, is that gun groups like the Brady Campaign and Everytown have wasted no time in attempting to profit off of this horrific tragedy in Uvalde, Texas. Everytown's fundraising email attempts to play on the emotions of those whose lives have been ripped apart by this tragic shooting is troubling. Their email says, quote, "This crisis will only end if we band together and demand action from our lawmakers. I need you in this fight." And at the end of the letter is a large red button that says, "Contribute to end gun violence." Now, Mr. Dettelbach, you're endorsed by Everytown. Is that right?
I believe so, Senator.
And are you willing to disavow their shameless immediate fundraising off of the Texas tragedy just hours after this tragedy occurred?
Senator, as I said, and I want to repeat and promise you, as ATF director, politics have absolutely no place in law enforcement. They have no place in an ATF director, and I don't view this as a Democrat or Republican issue. I view it as an opportunity to try to work together to make things better.
I appreciate that, and that's as it should be. Do you disavow these efforts?
Senator, I haven't seen what you're referring to, and it's not for me to get involved in a political argument. I am going to be a law enforcement person again, as I've done for 20 years, if I'm fortunate enough to be confirmed. And I vow I would never be involved in any political aspect of that kind of thing while I'm ATF director.
No, I appreciate that, and that's as it should be. I do think it's unfortunate that they're doing this literally hours after the shooting, and I don't think that's too difficult to disavow, but apparently you're not inclined to do that. And do you support the Biden administration's zero tolerance policy for federal firearms licensees?
Senator, I was not at the ATF when those policies were developed, and I've not had a chance to speak with the people at the ATF about all the things behind them. I can tell you, I represent now, and I'm in private practice, I represent businesses who deal with regulators. And to me, the three key things of good regulation is it has to be, number one, it has to be fair. Right? Number two, it has to be consistent. And number three, it has to be effective. And when, in my experience representing clients, when you can't do those things, it creates an uncertain business atmosphere for people who are trying to follow the law. And I would tell you, as an ATF director, that would be very important to me, is to find out how we can be, and you can do those things at the same time. It's not always easy, but you can, because it's important for people who have Second Amendment rights and who are business people.
Right. Now, to that end, do you believe that federal firearms licensees should have their licenses revoked for simple paperwork errors on Form 4473, or for missing outreach from ATF for a tracing request?
Senator, to me, again, I would have to look at any individual case, but I will tell you, Senator, people have to know that if they have a minor violation, it's going to be treated one way, and people have to know if it's more significant, it's going to be treated another. Every time, not depending on whether it's in Seattle or Miami or what month it is. And I would tell you, Senator, that would be very important to me to do that. I think the lawyers then argue about what happened, right? This was intentional, no, it wasn't intentional. That's where I think we can have discussions as a regulator in a regulated industry. But people should understand and have some predictability they're entitled to, is when you do this, this is what happens.
Yeah, and my time's expired. I would like you to answer that question, though, because it's a simple one. And I appreciate your willingness to say there should be clarity. I completely agree. I would like to know, though, whether a federally licensed firearms dealer should lose his or her license, based on simple paperwork errors in Form 4473.
Again, Senator, to me, it depends on each case is different. So, for instance, you say errors. I assume by that you mean something that's totally unintentional.
Yes.
Right. So unintentional violations are much less serious than intentional violations to me.
So on that basis, they should not lose their license?
Yes, I guess if it's happened 70 times over a period of years, I'm just making that up as an example. You look at the whole circumstance, but you should treat different cases differently.
In other words, absent aggravating factors or recidivist.
Or mitigating factors. And the lawyers argue about that, obviously, Senator.
Gotcha. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Leahy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With all due respect to my friend from Utah, and he is my friend, I'm getting concerned by hearing a number of people being critical of gun advocates, gun control advocates, or speaking out. It's almost a case of blaming the victims and not blaming the person who's able to walk in and buy a weapon that should be used on a war zone, not in a school zone. The kind of weapons that are being used by the Russians in Ukraine have no place in a school. It's not the time to blame the victims. It's time to blame those who sell weapons of war this way. And I seem outraged because gun violence continues to plague the country. As the senators from Connecticut pointed out, nearly 10 years ago, 20 children, 6 adults were slaughtered at Sandy Hook Elementary. This committee under my chairmanship advanced common sense legislation to address shortcomings in our gun policy. But what happened yesterday? 19 elementary school children, 2 teachers gunned down in their Texas school by a teenager. Nothing has changed. Nothing except more lives lost. When my Republican colleagues goes on television, oh, the answer to this is to arm the elementary school teachers. When my children, my grandchildren have been in elementary school, I expect the teachers to be teaching, not carrying guns. So we get empty thoughts and prayers and, oh, isn't it awful? Well, let's start doing something. Let's stand up as senators, both parties, and actually vote for real restrictions on guns. We're the only civilized nation on earth that watches our citizens, our children gunned down, and we do nothing to prevent it from happening again. We're cowards if we don't act. Cowards. Now, Mr. Dettelbach, it is good to see you again. As a former staff member of mine on this committee, I know your integrity, your honesty, how you worked with both Republicans and Democrats on this committee. Now, maybe you feel a little bit different sitting at the nominees table, but I congratulate you on your nomination. You served from 2009 to 2016 as U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Ohio. You spent 2 decades as a prosecutor. I think it's critically important that the ATF have a permanent director who can enforce our nation's gun laws. You're a career prosecutor. You could do that. In fact, I'd like to ask you one question. I've heard this from police officers and law enforcement, not only in my own state, but all over. There is an issue plaguing the ATF's National Tracing Center in West Virginia. The NTC is our country's only crime gun tracing facility. That means whenever a gun is found at a crime scene, law enforcement need to find the gun's last known owner. They submit a trace request to the National Tracing Center because that might trace down who some of the suspects or traffickers could be. But because of a misguided, I'd say stupid restriction imposed by Congress, the ATF is currently unable to electronically search the tens of millions of gun sale records currently in its possession. People should go and look at the warehouses full of paper records. My God, in 2022, ATF employees are forced to conduct these record searches by hand. The restriction on electronic search of these records, stupidly rooted in an irrational fear that lead to a National Registry of Firearms, has real-world implications for our law enforcement agents who need to quickly trace crime laws. I believe the Congress has to act to bring the ATF into the 21st century. Let it do what everybody else can do, electronically search crime gun records in their possession. And I reintroduced the Crime Gun Tracing Modernization Act last year with Congressman Pasquale, and I thank Senators Whitehouse and Feinstein and Gillibrand for joining as co-sponsors. Are you familiar with this issue I'm talking about with the paper records?
Senator, I'm generally familiar with it. Not having been at the ATF, I'm not as specifically familiar with it, but generally I am, yes.
Well, would you do tonight? Let me ask you this question. As someone who's been in law enforcement, do you believe that allowing ATF to electronically search crime gun records would aid the efforts of law enforcement?
Senator, as somebody who has been in law enforcement, having the ability to quickly, what the ATF does is they follow the firearm is an important thing for law enforcement. And I would tell you that whether under present tools or whether if Congress decides, if you decide, because that's your decision, not mine, I will use whatever tools that Congress gives me, and I'll always stay within the law to do our best to try and support state and local law enforcement to try and catch shooters.
Well, Chair Durbin, I'll close with this, mentioned a firearm used to tragic results bought through a straw purchaser. Chair Durbin and I and Senator Collins have reintroduced our legislation to stop these kinds of straw purchases. Do you agree that legislation making these kind of acts illegal in federal law might help?
Senator, again, I'm hopefully, if I'm privileged to be confirmed as ATF director, my job will be to do what Congress tells me to do. And I will use whatever tools you give me to do my best to enforce the laws as they are on the books. And I don't come to this position with a specific policy agenda, but I do know that people who straw purchase, it is a serious matter under current law, and whatever tools I'm given, I'll do my best to use them impartially but effectively to enforce the law.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Leahy. Senator Grassley?
The president gave you a tool recently. Last June, he announced that the ATF would be going after rogue gun dealers who, quote unquote, willfully violate the law with zero tolerance policy, a new policy. You'll be in charge of overseeing this policy if confirmed. Define rogue gun dealer for me.
Well, Senator, as I've said, to me, the key to an enforcement program is it has to be fair, it has to be consistent, and it has to be effective. And I'm not familiar with any legal definition. I think you look at each case and you decide, you look at the facts and you decide, okay, is this an intentional violation or not? Is this a repeated violation or not? Is it effective for the ATF to spend their time on this kind of violation? Meaning, does it go to the harm we're trying to protect the public from or not? And we do our best. I'm sorry, Senator.
I got you. Can you tell me what counts as a willful violation? Would it include a clerical error that would have been historically been treated with a warning?
Senator, to me, as a lawyer, the word willful implies something more than an inadvertent error. It implies an intentional misstatement. I haven't looked at at an individual case, but in general, in the law, the term willful implies a high level of intent.
Do you think this policy that the president announced could hurt the cooperative relationship between the ATF that it has with the industry?
Senator, even in my period as a nominee before this hearing, I have tried to and have reached out and communicated with people who represent and who are in the industry. And I know it is very important for an ATF director to hear from all interested parties, whether they're victim and survivor groups or people in the industry, to see what their perspective is. And I would commit, Senator, as if I were fortunate enough to be confirmed, to continue doing that, to hear all perspectives, to be a fair regulator.
When the previous nominee as director was made, gun owners had grave concerns that he didn't respect their Second Amendment rights. I'm trying to get a sense of how you'll approach regulation if you're confirmed. Can you tell me 2 gun control proposals that Mr. Chipman supported that you do not support, and 2 that you agree with him on, and if 2 is too many, 1 on each side?
Senator, I am not intimately familiar with Mr. Chipman's record. My record was...
That's okay then.
Okay.
Did you follow Mr. Chipman's nomination and the concerns that gun owners raised when you were preparing for this hearing, or didn't it come up as you prepared for it?
Certainly, I looked at some of the concerns that were raised in the prior hearing. I can't say I followed it, Senator. I just wasn't focused on that particular matter at that time.
Can you tell me the #1 source of tips that the ATF receives about firearm trafficking?
I can't because I haven't been there, but I have been told by people I've talked to in the run-up to this hearing that it's often the ATF does get tips from people in the industry.
Okay. I think that's a good answer. More specifically, I think it's a federal firearms licensee. As U.S. Attorney, did you prosecute any firearm trafficking cases that started with a tip from the licensees?
Senator, as the U.S. Attorney, you're not often privy to the details of how a particular case starts. It goes through the law enforcement, it'll go through the ATF or the FBI or local police. So I don't know the answer to that question, Senator.
Okay, thank you. I'll yield back and submit written questions for the 2 judges.
Thanks, Senator Grassley. Senator Feinstein?
Very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to use my time to make a statement, if I may. Just yesterday, the country watched as once again nearly 20 children were slaughtered in their classrooms in Texas. This was the 27th school shooting this year, and it comes just 8 days after 10 people were slaughtered in Buffalo, New York, while shopping for groceries. In both cases, the shooter was a teenager with an assault weapon. There have been more than 200 mass shootings this year, more than one per day, and this really breaks my heart, and it is simply unacceptable. We know what we need to do to stop this violence, but time and time again, we have failed to do it. We know what protections work to stop these killings. For example, in the 10 years that the assault weapons ban was in place, gun massacres dropped 37%. After the ban lapsed in 2004, gun massacres rose by 183%. There is simply no reason that average citizens need weapons of war to go about their daily life. And this is especially true of teenagers. The shooters in both Texas and New York weren't old enough to buy a beer, but they were able to buy an assault weapon. And that's why I recently introduced the Age 21 Act, along with several of my colleagues. The bill would fix this disparity by limiting a teenager's ability to buy assault weapons. Now, we seem to even lack the will to keep weapons away from those that we know are dangerous. Laws allowing gun restrictions to be placed on individuals who pose an extreme risk for the safety of others, as determined by a judge analyzing the facts in each case, face substantial opposition. And our domestic violence laws are riddled with loopholes that make it all too simple for people we know to be violent and possess weapons. Yet rather than take action, all we have done time and time again is to try to console the victims of these senseless tragedies and wait for the next inevitable attack. And we know that it will come. Just 1 year ago, this committee considered another nominee to serve as ATF director. The morning of that nominee's hearing, a gunman in San Jose, California, opened fire on a mass transit facility and killed 10 people. And here we are again, considering another nominee to serve as ATF director less than 24 hours after a mass shooting. Mr. Dettelbach, the role to which you have been nominated is an incredibly important one, and one which I intend to follow carefully. I understand that you have firsthand experience working to protect and support the victims of gun violence and their families from your time as a federal prosecutor. How has this experience informed your career, and how will you work to consider the victims of gun violence and their families as you carry out the ATF's enforcement mission, if you are confirmed?
Well, Senator, I think most prosecutors would answer this question the same way, which is when you graduate law school, the law is in the books. When you become a prosecutor and you interact with victims and survivors who have experienced incredible loss, it becomes a part of you, and it never leaves you. I know this morning I got a text from a woman who was a victim actually in an ATF case that our office did. It was a horrible arson actually, where 8 children were killed. And those relationships and that experience never leaves you, and it will never leave me in trying to work with law enforcement to enforce the law and remove dangerous criminals from our community.
Will you commit to this committee that you will be strong on this issue?
Senator, I will commit to this committee that I will be a law enforcement enforcer who is very strong.
Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Feinstein. Thank you very much, Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congratulations to all the nominees. Thank you for being here. Mr. Dettelbach, if I could start with you, I want to ask you about what you were just saying. You were a prosecutor, right, for some time.
I was, Senator.
You were the U.S. Attorney in Ohio.
Among other things, I was the U.S. Attorney in Ohio for just under 7 years, Senator.
That was from, remind me of the dates, 2009 to?
2009 to 2016.
Okay. And you were responsible as U.S. Attorney for your district for prosecuting all manner of crimes, including federal firearms crimes. Is that correct?
I oversaw an office that was responsible for federal prosecutions and law enforcement in the Northern District of Ohio.
Right, including firearms offenses. Were those high priority for you?
They were, Senator.
Yeah. Do you think that they should be a high priority?
I think, yes, I think you're working with local law enforcement and state law enforcement together, but together you're working in partnership, and violent crime and gun crime should be a priority. Terrorism is a priority also. There are other priorities, but yes,
Sure.
It is a priority.
Sure. And you just said that you just committed to Senator Feinstein that you'd be very strong in this role. And I assume you think it's important to be very strong as a prosecutor when it comes to violent crime, including firearms crime, like the kind that we saw yesterday. Is that fair to say?
Yes, Senator, I think it is. It's fair but strong, yes.
Yeah. So let me just ask you then about something in your record that puzzles me, and I was hoping you could walk me through it. When you became the U.S. Attorney, there were about 120 firearms and explosives prosecutions a year. By the time you left, there were half that number. And in fact, there was a pretty continuous decline over 3 years, lower year on year, 113 in 2014, 75 in 2015, 65 in 2016, which you just told me was your last year. What accounts for that? Walk me through that.
Yeah, sure, Senator. So prosecuting gun crime, look, from my earliest days as a prosecutor in Maryland, I was the liaison officer, what we then called Project Disarm, which meant I sat with an ATF agent and a PG County detective in a conference room every Monday morning with a stack of cases this high and went through which one should go state, which one, they would tell me, this is a dangerous person, we should go federal, this is a gang case, put it in a third pile. And I have been committed to that for many years. When I was U.S. Attorney, we already had in the office, my predecessor, who I worked for and did gun cases for, Greg White, who's supporting my nomination, he had an aggressive program, and we continued it. We never changed our intake guidelines. We never lowered them. There were times where we never raised them. We actually lowered them sometimes. If I got a phone call from Youngstown saying we're having a problem, we would go out and do what we call the VGRIP program. And I did that every summer in one city or another, depending on where the data showed the problems were. And so there were years where our gun crime prosecutions went up. And then there were years where they went down. We didn't change our guidelines. I will tell you, during some of those years, law enforcement, they're the ones who bring you the cases, right? Federal law enforcement and others, and my office too had significant staffing issues. I was U.S. Attorney during sequestration. I was U.S. Attorney during shutdown. I actually, to show people you had to do everything, I sat the reception desk at one point as U.S. Attorney. And so I can't tell you what causes ups and downs in those numbers, but I'll tell you one thing that didn't cause it was any change in our approach to what cases should be prosecuted in our office.
But it's a pretty big drop, isn't it? I mean, 121 cases brought the year you became U.S. Attorney. It's pretty constant then for, as you said, a couple of years, I assume, because you're following your predecessor's policy. And then it begins a steady decline down to 65. I mean, that's half as much. And what I notice is the next year, under your successor, it doubles. So help me understand. I mean, what is this? Was this just not something that you were pushing, or you said earlier, was this the police's fault?
No, it wasn't the police's fault, and it was something that I definitely focused significant time and attention on. The same people in the office who are great career assistant U.S. attorneys ran that program. It wasn't that I was just following the program of my predecessor. I believed in it, and we never changed it. So with respect to these kinds of cases, Senator, I never saw a situation where any person who worked for me in my office was declining cases. There was a time I remember in Akron, Ohio, where this great career assistant, probably one of the most aggressive gun prosecutors I ever met, she turned down a case. She said, it didn't match our guidelines. This chief of police in Akron called me, and he said, this is wrong. And I said, well, tell me what's going on. And she said, well, we don't have a predicate that matches the office policy, whatever it was at the time. Yes, but the Youngstown police chief, Jim Nice, just told me they like this guy for 2 homicides that they haven't caught him for, and he's terrorizing a complex. We're doing the case. And we did the case. That was my attitude from when I started to when I finished, and it was my predecessor's attitude and my successors who are all supporting me for this job.
So what you're telling me is you don't know why the prosecutions went in half, or why the cases, these aren't.
There were years it went up, I believe, Senator, also.
Well, sure, and I mentioned, it was about level. I mean, and your high water mark was 160, but then it goes down to 65, and as I said, there's a pattern here. It's a 3-year, 113 in 2014, 75 in 2015, 65 in 2016. But it sounds like you don't know. I mean, that's your testimony.
Yeah, my last day as U.S. Attorney was February 5th of 2016, Senator.
Right. So the cases that were prosecuted that year were in the pipeline under you. Did you study it? I mean, did you look at these numbers and say, this is disturbing? I mean, this needs to change. We need to get tough.
Senator, I think we enforce the law, and I will tell you that cases in that kind of program are very quick turnaround cases. We have to charge within sometimes a week or 2. It's not like a white collar case. Cops catch somebody in the street who's dangerous, they arrest them. We've got to charge.
So did crime go down during those years?
Crime did go down, but I don't know what the particular cause is. I know we never changed our policy, Senator, and I know that it was an office priority.
Why don't you take that for the record and get back to me on that? And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Let me recognize Senator Coons, who's been waiting. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse, and thank you to our 3 nominees in front of us today. I am not a rude man, but I will tell you I have genuinely struggled today. As a number of reporters were just talking to me in the hallway, I and my wife and my whole family, our heart is broken for parents and teachers and faculty and community members and school children who are today living through every family's worst nightmare. To have, again, 19 elementary school students massacred in their classrooms, to have their teachers killed defending them, and to have some describe this as unthinkable, unimaginable, when in fact it is entirely too predictable now. The pain that the Robb Elementary School community and that Uvalde, Texas is living through today is perhaps incomprehensible for those of us who have children, but it is entirely predictable. So I'll make a bold prediction. It will happen again and again until we collectively decide to find a path forward to responsibly address it. And we in the Senate need to have a better answer. While I am a praying man and believe in the power of prayer, I am sick to death of saying that my thoughts and prayers are with parents who are today waking up to the incomprehensible horror of having their child massacred at school. So we can't pretend that we didn't see this coming. We can't pretend that this isn't a pressing issue. And while I respect as strongly as any member of this committee the constitutional rights protected by our Bill of Rights, we need to act to ensure that tragedies like this do not continue happening with astonishing, embarrassing, gut-wrenching regularity. I know not one particular law that we could pass here will prevent every such tragedy, but we have to do more. We have to make it harder for individuals to get access to weapons who have demonstrated the capacity or the potential to use them to harm themselves or their families. And we have to do more to address gun violence. Every week in my hometown and in home cities and communities all over this country, gun violence takes lives in communities of all types and all backgrounds, and we cannot become numb to this. So forgive me, I'm going to focus my questioning at the nominee to lead the ATF. The ATF has been a very important part of trying to tackle gun violence in Delaware and around the nation. And Mr. Dettelbach, I am grateful that you are willing to step forward and to serve. We have not had a confirmed ATF leader in far too long, and it is my hope that we can confirm you. I am struck by the widespread support you have received from law enforcement. Your nomination has been endorsed by the International Association of Chiefs of Police, by the major county sheriffs, by Noble, by the Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association, by Women in Law Enforcement, by a bipartisan group of more than 140 members of the Justice Department. And with your forbearance, I'd just like to note a few of the quotes from the letters that members of this committee have received. Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association, with which I've worked closely, says that you have and I'm quoting, proven history of working with law enforcement, corrections officials, advocates, stakeholders, and elected officials across the political spectrum. When I was in county government, responsible for the second largest law enforcement agency in our state, I work closely with the IACP and deeply respect their scope and their service. The IACP wrote that your experience, your expertise, your record of success are evidence of your qualifications to serve as the next director of the ATF. And Noble, which has a chapter in my state and played a key role in my work to try and advance diversity within law enforcement, wrote that you've displayed the qualities of leadership, empathy, excellence, and persistence in supporting and defending our Constitution while enshrining justice for all Americans. I think that speaks highly to why we should confirm you, why we should make sure that in many ways the most important federal agency related to firearms has Senate-confirmed leadership. Could you please briefly describe how you've managed to work collaboratively with federal, state, and local law enforcement in your time as U.S. Attorney to help prevent rising gun crime while still respecting our Constitution?
Senator, and to hear those quotes from the men and women who are on the front lines protecting us every day is humbling. During my time as a prosecutor, 30 years, I think one of the single biggest changes was the level of partnership between federal, state, and local law enforcement. When I started, there was speeches that you got about how it's a one-way street. We tell you what we want on the federal side, you don't get to hear. That's gone. That's no longer the case. And to me, the task force and that partnership is the single biggest advance and the biggest weapon we have to fight violent crime together. And so I believe deeply in it, and I believe that the ATF especially has been on the forefront of that. The ATF is a boots-on-the-ground law enforcement partner, and that's the philosophy I would bring to the ATF.
Well, thank you. As the founder and co-chair of the Law Enforcement Caucus here in the Senate, that has done a lot to try and strengthen and sustain that federal-local partnership and that engagement with stakeholders. I very much look forward to your confirmation. It is less than 2 weeks from when there was a racist attack in Buffalo in which a man wearing body armor, carrying an AR-15, killed 10 innocent people. We cannot afford to keep saying someday in the future, somehow we will take action. And I think the least we could do is deliver a Senate-confirmed leader for the ATF. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I think Senator Cotton is next.
Thank you. Mr. Dettelbach, in your 2018 campaign for Attorney General, you called for a ban on so-called assault weapons. What is an assault weapon? Could you define it for me?
Senator, when I was a candidate for office, I did talk about restrictions on assault weapons. I did not define the term, and I haven't gone through the process of defining that term. That would only be for the Congress if it chose to take that up to do, and if you chose to take it up, I would be at the ATF, and there was perhaps expertise or data we could give you so that you could make the appropriate decision to both protect the public and protect the Second Amendment.
So you're running for public office and you called for a ban on assault weapons, but you don't have a definition for assault weapons?
Senator, it would only be for a legislative body, whether it was the Ohio legislature or the Congress. It would only be for a legislative body to do that work. And I acknowledge it would be a difficult task to define assault weapons because, on one hand, you don't want it to be so narrow that it doesn't offer the protections that are intended. And on the other hand, you certainly don't want it to be so broad so that it infringes unnecessarily on the rights of citizens. So I acknowledge that's a difficult task, but it would be for this body to do, not for me.
Why is it so hard to define assault weapons?
Well, I think, Senator, what I told you, which is that it is you don't want it to be so narrow as to be meaningless, and you don't want it to be so broad as to infringe on the rights of law-abiding Americans unnecessarily.
Congress took an effort at that definition in 1994. What did you think of that definition that Congress used?
I don't know enough about that. That's a definition that I'm not particularly familiar with, and I haven't studied the data on how on that particular definition. I've heard comments on both sides of that, Senator. I acknowledge that's a very difficult issue. That is for this body to decide.
Is it because that there's really not a category of weapons known as assault weapons? I mean, there's rifles, there's shotguns, there's pistols. Can you go into a federally licensed firearm dealer and find the category of weapons labeled on the wall as assault weapons?
I don't believe that's a category of weapons that's labeled on the wall of retailers. It's not necessarily what retailers call it that would affect the decision of a legislative body, but no, to answer to your question.
It's what politicians and lawyers in Washington call it.
Well, it would, Senator, for me, it would be what elected legislators who are charged with having these discussions and debates would choose or not choose to call it.
Okay. I think it's very telling that you're nominated to lead the ATF and you don't have a definition of assault weapon. And the point is that there is really no such thing as a category of weapons known as assault weapons. There are rifles, there are shotguns, there are pistols, they have properties, they have features, but there is no such thing as a category of assault weapons. I want to turn to the Southern Poverty Law Center. In 2017, you called for treating as terrorist groups organizations that have been labeled as hate groups by the Southern Poverty Law Center, which itself is a corrupt slush fund for liberal causes with its own very troubled history of racist and sexist record. You said in that op-ed that we should pass new laws to label those groups as terrorist and, quote, disrupt them. One such group that the Southern Poverty Law Center has labeled as a hate group, which you therefore said you would treat as a terrorist group, is the Family Research Council. Do you believe that the Family Research Council is a hate group and should be treated as terrorists?
Senator, I think in the article that you're referring to, Senator, I cited a number of hate groups, the number that the Southern Poverty Law Center said existed in Ohio. And Senator, I do not.
There were about 33 of them.
I don't believe that. I have no. I'm not a member of that group. And I'm not associated with that group. But it would be obviously not for a private group to define what a terrorist organization was. I was making the point that there are domestic terrorism organizations that espouse violence. The key is groups that espouse violence, and that we ought to treat those domestic terrorism organizations that espouse violence the same way or using some of the same models as I was using on Al-Qaeda when I did Al-Qaeda cases, Hezbollah cases, because the key is violence, right? But the
Southern Poverty Law Center calls groups like the Family Research Council a hate group, and you said you wanted to treat them like a terrorist group. What about another one is the Alliance Defending Freedom? Do you think the Alliance Defending Freedom should be treated like Al-Qaeda?
Sir, I'm not familiar with either of those groups, and I wouldn't categorize them.
But you're familiar with the Southern Poverty Law Center, right?
I'm familiar with the group generally. Yes, I am, sir, but I'm not.
Are you familiar with its troubled history of racism and sexism?
Sir, I'm not deeply familiar with them. Okay. I know something about the group, but I'm not familiar with the things that you may be referring to.
Should you be confirmed, I encourage you to familiarize yourself with the Southern Poverty Law Center before you ever cite them, and certainly before you rely on them using federal power. My time's expired.
Thanks very much. Let me make sure that we have into the record the broad support for Mr. Dettelbach from America's law enforcement community. And without objection, I will put into the record the letter of support from the National Sheriff's Association. I will put into the record the letter of support from the International Association of Chiefs of Police. And I will put into the record the letter of support from the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. I would add that the Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association, the Major County Sheriff's Association, Women in Federal Law Enforcement, a separate organization, 141 former Department of Justice officials from both parties, the prosecutors in the Oklahoma City bombing case, the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys, the Hispanic American Police Command Officers Association, and others have expressed their support for Mr. Dettelbach based on his distinguished record of fair and effective prosecution as U.S. Attorney and elsewhere in his career. I would like to say that it's intensely frustrating to the point of sickening to serve in this body while massacres of children and others take place in venues like grocery stores and elementary schools, and be unable to pass simple laws that are well accepted not only by the American people, but by gun-owning Americans that have records of success at the state level and that we can't do a thing about here. And I think there's a very simple reason why we can't do a thing about it here, and that's the National Rifle Association. We got letters from throughout law enforcement. We didn't get one for Mr. Dettelbach for the National Rifle Association, but it is immensely impactful in this room and in our body. We have many colleagues who heel to the NRA's direction and bidding. They do so because the dark money operation run by the National Rifle Association has immense, if secretive, political clout. It's impossible to track the money flowing in and out of the NRA because it's not properly disclosed, but there has been evidence that Russian money has flowed into the NRA, and that has not been dispelled by any light of transparency shown at the NRA. We are obliged to talk about reasonable responses to these massacres and murders, and there is absolutely nothing about the NRA's position in these matters that is reasonable. It has an absolutist ideology about guns that is driven by economic motivation to keep the gun manufacturers making profits, and they get their way because they enforce that ideology driven by economic motivation with massive dark money political muscle. It's not the only place in which dark money political muscle has disabled the Congress, but it is certainly one of the worst. And if we're going to put an end to it, we're going to have a bit of a reckoning with the behavior of the NRA and its absolutist positions and its refusal to disclose its donors and the whole mess that it has created, where we can't have reasonable bipartisan discussions about what needs to be done to fix this problem. So I will yield back there. I will ask Mr. Dettelbach a question for the record. I've been a prosecutor like you. We've got the situation one sees all too often where police roll up to a shooting scene. The EMTs are perhaps there dealing with the victims. The police tape may be out already. The sidewalk and the street are scattered with shells ejected by the shooter. The shooter is long gone, but the cartridge casings contain incredibly important evidence that, if brought to those police officers on the scene quickly, can help give them information that could be essential to being able to locate the escaped shooter and prevent further injuries. And I will ask you, in a question for the record, to lay out how, as ATF director, you will enhance the ability of local law enforcement to get that information as quickly as possible and as effectively as possible so that they can solve these crimes as quickly and effectively as possible. My time has expired, so I will yield back to the chairman.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. Senator Booker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just want to say to all the three people at the panel, I want to thank you for being here. Your bios are extraordinary. You are true patriots. Your commitment to your country and your willingness to serve is something that is both humbling to me and very inspiring. I want to thank your families that are here too. This is not an easy path that you have chosen, and you do not do it alone, as you said in your introductory remarks. And I want to thank them for their commitment to country and their willingness to support you in this path. I will be supporting all three of you happily, maybe even gleefully, on the floor of the United States Senate. I look forward to taking that vote. I want to, as most people have, you all are very fortunate that you are sitting next to a man trying to be the head of the ATF, which hasn't had a head of it for years. I want to say to Mr. Dettelbach, I'm looking forward to supporting you as well. And there's a lot being said about you. And I just find it astonishing to look at the law enforcement list that my colleague just read off of the incredible folks that are behind you. It really says that should rest your case right now. But I'm also aware of the fact that even Donald Trump couldn't get his nominee to the ATF confirmed, not because he didn't have law enforcement support. He was the former head of the FOP, our largest police union, or at least a leader there. But it was, again, the power of these lobbies that do not represent the majority of gun owners' positions on issues revolving around guns. I know the kind of leader you'll be. I have such great confidence in you. And I simply want to just, in the little bit of time that I have, though, drill down on a frustration I've had. As Senator Whitehouse talked about, both of us come from the world where we were very focused on local law enforcement. And I remember my first trip down to Washington as a mayor of New Jersey's largest city, talking to one of the leaders of the ATF and being stunned at this candor with me about how much this body, Congress, has handcuffed the ATF to actually just enforce the laws that we have. I was really stunned when he started going through chapter and verse, all the riders that have been put into big legislation, all the things that have been done to their budget, all the outrageous loopholes that prevent the ATF from using modern policing. You are the one agency, I hope you will be the head of the one agency, that Republicans, in effect, are happy to defund. The ATF has not kept up with the other law enforcement federal agencies in funding. If you look at the budget of the ATF, it's been stagnant over the last 10 years. The budgets of other federal law enforcement agencies have increased dramatically in comparison. For example, from 2005 to 2014, the FBI's budget up 62%, Customs and Borders budget 46%, 94%, Customs and Border Protection. It goes on and on and on. And the increase of your budget has barely kept up with inflation. The manpower shortages at the ATF are stunning to me. You and I both know, because we've been in this world, that these straw purchases, which I've heard from some of my colleagues, source a significant amount of the illegal weapons that end up in the hands of people that shouldn't buy these weapons. But the ATF has fewer employees, it had fewer employees in 2017 than it did in 2002 to enforce these laws. The ATF literally has fewer special agents than the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police has sworn officers. They have 760 ATF investigators who are responsible for 130,000 federal firearm licensees. That ATF leader that I first met when I was mayor told me we were asked to do our job with both hands tied behind our backs and our feet in leg irons. And so all of this talk about the legislation that we're proposing, common sense, bipartisan legislation, you rightfully say that's what Congress is all almost obscuring the fact that we have an agency that has the power to protect Americans, and we're not funding it, we're not supporting it, and we have done outrageous things to it, like not allow it to use computers. I'm going to submit this to the record, that we literally have this insanity that when there's a going out of business gun retailer, first of all, there's what's called the fire sale loophole, Mr. Chairman. I know you know this, that they have to do background checks when they sell their gun, but if they're going out of business, they can dump their inventory on people without doing background checks. And then when the ATF tries to keep records of this, they have to keep them all on paper. And it gets so bad at the ATF that every time they get new agencies going, they literally have to put them into shipping containers outside because the floor of the building would buckle. It is so ridiculous what my Republican colleagues have done over the years to undermine law enforcement from protecting communities. And so, sir, I just want you to know, God bless you for stepping up to lead an agency that hasn't had a head for the longest time, that Donald Trump couldn't even get ahead because a very corporate, industrial-driven lobby is dictating policy here more than the good conscience of folks. But I hope when you come for your first oversight hearing, because we're going to get you confirmed, I'm going to work like crazy to make sure that happens. I just hope that you will look Congress in the eye and tell them, like I was told as a young mayor, that you don't have the resources to enforce the laws of the United States of America, that you don't have the personnel to adequately enforce the laws of the United States of America, that you don't have the computer equipment, that there are riders that have been put in that undermine your ability to get the job, that there's technology out there that can make us safer that you're not allowed to use. This is a shameful charade. This is despicable that the same people that try to accuse us wrongfully of defunding the police have taken one of the most important law enforcement agencies to protect Americans, to protect our children, our churches, our mosques, our synagogues, our parks, our supermarkets, is not allowed to do their job. And we yet again are sacrificing our children on the altar of inaction. And it hurts. And you know where I live. I've lost kids I know. I see shrines on streets. And when my law enforcement wants to do the job, as you're right, in partnership with the ATF, there is barrier after barrier put up by Congress. And so, dear God, bless you and your family for leading an agency where you're going to be attacked every single day when you just try to enforce the laws that are on the books. You're going to be vilified and cursed. I see it happening right now, people trying to block your nomination. But I just simply say to you, sir, God bless you, because you're doing righteous work. And I have faith that you will protect citizens. But the shame is not on you or your agency and the proud officers, law enforcement officers who dedicate themselves to our safety. The shame is on this body for what we're not doing to support you. May God bless this country. May we confirm you. And may we somehow end this national nightmare that every day 100 Americans are dying by gun violence.
Thank you, Senator Booker. Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Like several of the members of the committee, I want to share just a couple remarks in response to the tragedy from yesterday, but I know our time is limited, so I'll jump to my questions first and end with remarks of what happened in Uvalde yesterday. Mr. Dettelbach, welcome. As a U.S. attorney, as I understand, you prosecuted a number of suspects for very violent crimes, including those using guns. We know President Biden has made it a priority for the administration to disrupt what experts refer to as the iron pipeline. The pipeline refers to the path by which guns flow from southern states with looser restrictions up Interstate 95 to northern states with stricter gun laws. And by the way, it's not the only region to happen. There's pipelines with similar dynamics in other parts of the country, including out west. But the iron pipeline and others like it undermine efforts of many states and major cities to protect their communities who pass laws to help prevent gun violence. Yet a number of states continue to expand access to firearms and loosen their restrictions without justification. And the lack of action at the federal level leaves communities at the mercy of what seems to be a race to the bottom. So, Mr. Dettelbach, can you briefly describe how the iron pipeline increases the prevalence of gun violence in American cities and why a federal response is required?
Senator, in my time as a prosecutor, especially as U.S. attorney, I learned that one of the most important tools we have is data. We collect data, we follow the data so that we don't let our own predilections interfere with how we deploy resources. And so I'm not privy to all the data, but I know that the president and the Attorney General have prioritized, based on data, certain regions and areas where we have seen an increase in firearms trafficking, and established task forces, because that's another tool in addition to data, so that federal law enforcement can be a force multiplier for state law enforcement in trying to disrupt illegal gun trafficking. And so I believe that that's an effective approach. I believe that we need to scale it. I'm not in the ATF yet, so I don't know the specific areas where we're seeing the trafficking, but I think that's an important approach, Senator.
Well, once you're there, you will be privy to the data, and you'll see the data justifies my statement, President's focus on this, and I pray your response when the time comes. Data tells us that it's not the only issue. There's an increasing concern about the prevalence of ghost guns and their impact on public safety. Look, I represent California, and I'm proud of the state's efforts to address gun violence broadly, starting with the governor, legislative leaders, and others. In addition to the dynamic of the iron pipeline, California's laws and restrictions versus other states in the West, ghost guns is increasingly a top priority. And last year, Senators Blumenthal and Senator Cruz held a subcommittee hearing on this very important topic. Now, ghost guns are weapons built by individuals using components they've purchased online. These guns lack serial numbers, which is typically used to track weapons by law enforcement. So no serial numbers, no data, to your point. And because these guns are usually built at the purchaser's home, there's also no background check that goes along with it, no registration process, or even an age limit that is on the books. Clearly, ghost guns have become a problem throughout the country, but in Southern California in particular, violence with the involvement of ghost guns is up significantly. Can you just briefly discuss the ramifications involved if unregulated gun production continues to increase?
Senator, one of the things I've done up till now, since my nomination, is talk to a lot of law enforcement officials, and they have told me that ghost guns present them with a violent crime problem. My understanding of the regulation that the ATF put out is that it would require serial numbers and background checks for a certain category of individually made firearms, and that would enable people to avoid a background check by, for instance, purchasing one of these buy, build, shoot kits, which is basically a gun that you assemble on your own, but you buy together. And so closing that loophole would enable us to get serial numbers from guns found at crime scenes, and would also enable us in certain circumstances to run background checks on individuals to prevent people who everybody agrees should not have a firearm from having one.
Okay, thank you. I'll look forward to following up and working with you on these critical issues. And Mr. Chair, just in closing, I just want to join the chorus of members of this committee and the Senate in sharing my condolences to the families and the communities reeling from recent gun violence across the country, from Buffalo, New York, to Laguna Woods, California, and now Uvalde, Texas. The gun violence in our communities that our communities are experiencing is simply unacceptable. I've spoken nonstop since yesterday's tragedy, not just as a senator, but Mr. Chair, as you know, as a father of 3 young school-aged children. This shouldn't have to be the case. And in the last 2 weeks, we've experienced at least 22 mass shootings across the country. No other developed country has to deal with this, but we do. Now, some folks suggest that arming teachers or providing more armed presence on school campuses will make them safer. If more guns were the answer, the United States would be the safest nation in the world. But it's not the case. When I was growing up, I remember on at least an annual basis, We'd go through these fire drills at school, what to do if there's a fire on campus. I come from California. I grew up in California, so we're also not unfamiliar with earthquake drills. To think that our young people today have to practice active shooter training is a sad statement on our society when young children don't feel safe going to school, when people have to wonder whether it's safe to go to a grocery store or a house of worship. It's a nightmare come true. I know the jurisdiction over gun safety straddles a few committees. I sit on the Homeland Security Committee, but this is the primary, the Judiciary Committee, and I hope that we can find the will to advance common sense gun safety legislation. Because yes, it is a choice to take action. Inaction is also a choice. I choose to take action. We cannot sit idly by and watch children in America die to gun violence. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Padilla. Judge Wong, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
I'm fine. And I wanted to ask you a question as we wrap up here. You've been a magistrate for 7 years. And in your court, is there a limitation on the types of cases which you can sit on?
Slightly. So magistrate judges under the statute cannot hear federal felony cases.
So let me pull the microphone closer to you if you can. There you go. Make sure the red light is on. There we go. Let's try.
Federal magistrate judges under the statute cannot hear federal felony cases. And then to be a presiding judge under the statute, you need consent of all parties.
So your experience in the criminal field, did you have some in previous assignments, either as assistant U.S. attorney or otherwise?
As an assistant United States attorney, I prosecuted one criminal trial, but as a federal magistrate judge, we handle all criminal matters up to the point of arraignment.
Including trials?
Including trials. And then we also include federal misdemeanor cases.
Oh, it's good to know. I looked at some of the cases you handled. It's a wide variety and kind of surprising. The magistrate in my area is chosen by the other judges. Is that the case in your situation?
In the District of Colorado, it first goes through a nonpartisan committee that makes recommendations to our district judges, and then our district judges make the final decision.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to make that for the record. I understand Senator Klobuchar can't join us physically, but would like to come on remotely. We're going on 3 hours here, so I hope, if I'm right, is she ready?
I'm here. Senator Durbin, I was there. I just was asked to go meet with the Prime Minister of New Zealand. So
Well,
I'm
you
back
are
remote.
such a name dropper. And
Yeah, well, I was actually at the hearing. So because I think it is so important right now, as Senator Padilla has pointed out, that with such passion, and you have, Senator Durbin, time and time again, these shootings happen, whether it's what happened in Buffalo, whether it is what happened yesterday, Sandy Hook. I remember after Parkland actually being invited when President Trump was in office over to the White House. And I still have the piece of paper where I wrote down how many times he said that he wanted to get universal background checks done. Not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 9 times at that meeting. He said he wanted to get universal background checks done. Then the next day, he went and he met with the NRA and he changed his tune. He changed his mind. And I think that is just happening too much in this country, and it's time to stand up to them. Mr. Dettelbach, just so you know, I ushered through the last ATF nominee that actually made it, and that was Todd Jones of the state of Minnesota. And he got Republican support. I remember we had to leave the vote open on the floor for hours, but we got it done. And I certainly hope that happens with you, with your background, with everything as has been pointed out, including what the president of the International Associations of Police have said, the support that you have had from Federal Law Enforcement Association, Major County Sheriffs of America. And I actually talked about you to my U.S. Attorney, Andy Lugar, who knows you. And I've heard from him and others about the work that you've done to combat gun violence. And could you tell me about some of the successful initiatives that you led as U.S. Attorney to address gun violence?
Thank you, Senator. The two U.S. attorneys I worked with from your district were both incredible people, Todd Jones and Andy Lugar. I had the privilege of working with them and learned a lot from hearing of the things that they were doing in your state. One program that I thought was a very, very good program was something called the NOVIC program, the Northern Ohio Violent Crime Consortium. It was a program that was actually started by my predecessor, the Bush U.S. Attorney. It was an excellent program, but it involved trying to use grant money to get the 8 largest police departments in the district to pilot programs about data usage and data-driven policing. And so one of the problems that local law enforcement faces is that they just don't have enough funds sometimes to be creative. They're so busy and so focused on 911 response time, as we can all understand. And so we were able to, through the Department of Justice, starting this task force, to give them, the chief, some money to be creative with. And it was incredible to see what they came up with. Every city was different. They all spent it on different things. One wanted better camera systems that fed directly into 911 responses. A second one wanted to focus on gathering data from a certain district in their city that had high crime. And so that was a great program. And it involved, as all these do, listening to local law enforcement about what they need.
Very good. I truly appreciate that. Just one last question, because I know you've had a long hearing, as Senator Durbin pointed out. Last November, Senator Booker and I sent a letter to Attorney General Garland about the proliferation of so-called auto-steer gun modification devices, which can effectively turn a semi-automatic into a fully automatic. And these devices can sadly be purchased cheaply online or 3D printed, installed in a minute. They are often imported from overseas, can be purchased for as little as $19. How can the ATF help local law enforcement, as you talked about that partnership, to address the use of these illegal devices?
Senator, I'm generally familiar with the problems involving converting weapons that are legal weapons into illegal weapons, and automatic weapons, of course, fall into that category. I don't know about where things stand certainly currently on that, but I would commit to you, Senator, if I'm confirmed, that I could look into that, and I would love to work together to try to find solutions.
All right. Well, thank you. I wish you well. I hope we can get your nomination done swiftly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Klobuchar. Before I